she said, "my body isn't your resource anymore." I said, "Done." But that wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. The first time I saw her, I didn't understand the gravity of it. She was all calm authority and effortless grace, moving through the office with a presence that made the fluorescent lights feel softer, like they were adjusting just for her. I was 24, fresh out of college, eager to prove myself, and painfully aware of how much younger I was. She was in her early 40s, confident in a way that drew people in, yet carrying a quiet vulnerability that only showed when she thought no one was watching. Our worlds collided the moment we were assigned to the same project. She had this way of speaking that made every word land, slow, deliberate, yet warm, like a conversation meant for listening, not just hearing. I caught myself stealing glances at her during meetings, noticing how her hands moved when she explained a point, how she'd tuck a strand of hair behind her ear absent-mindedly, or the faint perfume she wore that lingered long after she'd left the room. It was intoxicating, but I told myself repeatedly, keep it professional. We started with small interactions, shared coffee runs, passing notes on project revisions, quiet chuckles over minor office mishaps. Those moments were electric in a way I didn't fully understand. A touch here, a smile there, a fleeting glance that lasted too long. She had this uncanny ability to make me feel seen without words, and yet, I was painfully aware of the boundaries. Her life was a puzzle I was only allowed to peek at, not enter. Then came the text. It appeared on my phone like a lightning strike, "My body isn't your resource anymore." I stared at it, the words heavy, sharp, and impossibly intimate. I knew exactly what she meant, yet reading it felt like the floor had shifted beneath me. I typed back a single word, "Done." Not out of defiance, but out of respect. And then, silence. That silence was loud. Her lawyer, who I had met only briefly, laughed when I mentioned it later. It wasn't cruel, just knowing, almost amused by the tension that had sprung up between us. And yet, that one exchange set the tone for everything that followed. There was no turning back from the awareness it brought: desire, tension, curiosity, and an undeniable connection. In that first part of our story, it's not about what happened next. It's about the collision, two people from different worlds, separated by age, experience, and unspoken rules, suddenly aware of the magnetic pull between them. Every glance, every brush of hands over documents, every shared laugh, became loaded with meaning. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the tension was there, a slow-burning ember that promised everything and nothing at once. And in the quiet aftermath of her text, I realized that the rules had changed. The game had started, and neither of us knew the outcome yet. But for the first time I felt it, that dangerous, thrilling awareness that this woman, this impossibly composed, quietly vulnerable woman, was no longer just a professional colleague. She had become someone I could not stop noticing, someone who had already begun to occupy the space inside me I didn't know was empty. After her text, a new rhythm settled over our interactions, cautious, deliberate, loaded with unspoken rules. I had thought I understood boundaries before, but suddenly, every glance, every movement, every shared space felt charged. The office, once a place of simple focus, became a landscape of tension and awareness. I could feel her presence before I saw her, like a shift in the air, a faint perfume, the soft click of her heels on polished floors, the careful tilt of her head as she listened. And I realized, quietly, painfully, that she was aware of it too. She maintained her distance with grace. Conversations became structured, polite, measured. Meetings were professional, emails concise, interactions courteous but distant. There were no accidental touches, no lingering laughs, no private jokes, at least, not intentionally. And yet, every small interaction carried weight. A brief brush of a hand when passing a document felt heavier than it should, a simple nod of acknowledgement lingered longer than expected, and even the slight raising of her eyebrows in response to a question seemed to contain a universe of unspoken emotion. Her lawyer became a subtle presence in this dance, a reminder of rules, boundaries, and consequences. I met him once, during a brief discussion over logistics, and he laughed lightly at a situation I barely understood. It wasn't mockery, just that knowing, ironic amusement of someone who sees the tension but doesn't intervene. That laugh echoed in my mind more than I cared to admit. It was a symbol, almost, of the invisible walls now standing between us. I spent hours reflecting on the text she had sent. My body isn't a resource anymore. The words weren't just about physical boundaries, they were about trust, respect, and personal autonomy. I understood, and yet, a part of me ached at the distance they imposed. Every professional interaction became a study in restraint, careful movements, measured speech, and constant vigilance over thoughts that threatened to cross invisible lines. And still, there were moments that betrayed the walls she had built. I caught her looking at me for just a beat too long during a meeting, her gaze thoughtful and questioning. Sometimes her lips curved into a small, private smile when a comment struck her just right, or she paused mid-sentence, fingers brushing against her notebook as though she had been startled by her own emotion. Those tiny cracks revealed a vulnerability beneath her composed exterior, a subtle invitation to see more, to understand more, even if we were forbidden from crossing the line. It was exhausting, exhilarating, and terrifying all at once. I was learning patience in a way I hadn't before, discovering the weight of desire contained, and the strange intimacy of respecting someone's boundaries while simultaneously longing to breach them. Our connection had not ended, it had only evolved into a delicate tension, a dance along invisible lines where every gesture, every glance, and every word mattered. In this part of the story, boundaries are the story itself. The friction, the restraint, the unspoken acknowledgement of feelings, it all builds the foundation for something far more profound. And as I watched her move through her day, confident yet quietly vulnerable, I realized the truth: desire unspoken is not absence, it is preparation. And in the quiet, careful space between us, something powerful was waiting to emerge. By this point, the boundaries she had drawn were no longer walls but a quiet, intricate dance we both knew how to navigate. The text had shifted everything, yet nothing had changed outwardly. Meetings, emails, casual greetings, all were as professional as ever. But beneath that surface, a silent conversation had begun, carried in glances, pauses, and gestures that said more than words ever could. I noticed it first in the small ways. The way her eyes lingered on mine for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, the subtle arch of her brow when she found something amusing, or the almost imperceptible tilt of her head as if she were considering whether to reveal a thought only I could understand. Each moment was a delicate thread, weaving tension and curiosity between us, like the quiet hum of electricity before a storm. We started finding ourselves in situations that forced closeness, a shared coffee break, an impromptu discussion over a project, even a hallway encounter where we reached for the same folder. Our hands would brush briefly, a spark felt through the skin, a pulse that lingered long after we pulled away. She never let it go further than subtlety allowed, but the restraint itself became a language, one of awareness, longing, and careful respect. Texts became our silent playground. They were playful, sometimes teasing, often carefully neutral, yet loaded with double meanings that only the two of us understood. A simple "did you finish that report" could carry warmth, humor, and a subtle challenge all at once. Reading her words late at night, alone in my apartment, I could almost hear the inflection, see the half-smile I knew would accompany them. Each message was a quiet conversation that no one else could overhear, and I cherished it more than I cared to admit. The emotional intimacy was growing alongside the tension. She let small cracks appear in her composed exterior, a sigh when a task became frustrating, a fleeting glance that suggested hesitation or longing, a quiet admission of exhaustion. And I was learning to meet it with attentiveness rather than impulsive desire. I listened more, noticed more, and learned that closeness could exist without overt action. Sometimes, simply being present, offering a steady gaze or a gentle nod, could communicate more than words ever could. Our connection was intoxicating because it was unspoken. Every shared laugh, every subtle gesture, every prolonged moment of eye contact became a thread in a tapestry that neither of us dared fully display. The office had become a stage for this slow burn, a place where tension was built not by passion, but by restraint, and in that restraint, the intimacy grew stronger. By the end of this part, it was clear, we were no longer colleagues merely sharing tasks. We were two people learning the weight of presence, the power of a glance, the electricity of proximity. Our silent conversations were the foundation for something deeper, an emotional connection that was already shaping every thought, every action, and every heartbeat. And even though neither of us could say it aloud, the awareness of what was building between us hung in the air like a promise, quiet but undeniable. Everything we had built, the quiet understanding, the subtle glances, the unspoken connection, suddenly felt fragile, as if one wrong move could shatter it. Misunderstandings are strange things. They rarely arrive with thunder, they creep in, quietly, in a glance misread, a word taken wrong, or a laugh heard without context. That was exactly what happened. It started with a moment in the office, completely ordinary on the surface. I had observed her talking with her lawyer, the same figure who had laughed the first time I replied to her text. He chuckled lightly at something she said, and I, standing nearby, misinterpreted it as mockery, a subtle dismissal of me. My chest tightened. I couldn't tell whether it was jealousy, hurt, or pride, but something in me shifted. Later, she noticed. Maybe it was the stiffness in my posture, the slight coolness in my tone, or the way my eyes avoided hers during the afternoon meeting. She confronted me quietly, her voice calm, measured, but carrying an edge of concern. "Are you upset?" she asked, not accusing, just observing. That single question felt heavier than any argument I'd ever had. Her eyes searched mine, looking for something, maybe reassurance, maybe honesty. I opened my mouth to explain, but the words tangled in my throat. How could I articulate that I felt hurt not by her, but by a moment misread, by my own insecurities wrapped around the context of boundaries and propriety? So I stayed silent, letting the tension hang between us like a physical weight. It wasn't just the misunderstanding, it was the awareness of everything at stake. The age difference, the professional boundaries, the delicate, slow-building connection we'd nurtured over weeks, all suddenly felt precarious. Every glance, every hand brushing against hers, every subtle touch became magnified in my mind. I wanted to explain, to reassure her that my feelings were not accusations, that my admiration and care were not contingent on her approval, but on something deeper. She, for her part, handled it with grace. No sharp words, no blame, only the quiet steadiness that had always drawn me in. Her fingers brushed briefly against a stack of papers as she spoke, almost as if grounding herself, as her eyes met mine with patience and expectation. I could see the vulnerability there, the hint of frustration that she, too, wanted to bridge the gap without breaking professional decorum. By the end of the day, the misunderstanding had not fully resolved, but it had done something essential. It exposed the depth of our connection. Conflict, even subtle and quiet, revealed emotional stakes we hadn't fully acknowledged. I realized that this was no longer a simple attraction, no longer a private tension to be ignored. It was a bond, complex, fragile, and profoundly real. Friction, as I learned that day, is not just conflict, it's the fire that tests the strength of a connection. And in that quiet, tense office, surrounded by the hum of computers and the soft shuffle of papers, I understood that our story was entering a new phase. One that demanded honesty, patience, and emotional courage. The slow burn was no longer just simmering, it was stirring, ready to flare if mishandled, or to illuminate something beautiful if nurtured. The tension between us, once a quiet hum, had begun to swell into something that demanded acknowledgement. After the misunderstanding, we both carried an unspoken weight, not resentment, but awareness of how much this connection meant, and how careful we had to be. It was in that space, delicate and charged, that vulnerability finally began to surface. It started with a small moment, entirely mundane but transformative. We were reviewing a project late in the office, the glow of computer screens casting soft shadows across her face. She sighed quietly, brushing a loose strand of hair from her eyes, and I noticed a flicker of exhaustion and frustration that I hadn't seen before. Without thinking, I reached out and rested my hand lightly on her shoulder, not in ownership, but as a gesture of support. Her initial startle softened into a quiet acknowledgement, her eyes meeting mine in a long, steady gaze. That one touch spoke more than words ever could: recognition, understanding, and trust. From that night onward, our interactions shifted subtly but irrevocably. She began sharing pieces of herself that were previously hidden beneath her composed exterior, a worry about family, a fleeting fear about professional expectations, moments of doubt that she rarely voiced aloud. And I listened. Not as a savior, not as someone trying to fix, but as someone truly present. I learned to feel her hesitation, to read her silences, and to respond with gentle attentiveness. Physical affection remained small, but intensely meaningful. A hand brushing against hers as she handed me a document, fingers grazing the edge of a notebook when we reached for it at the same time, the warmth of her shoulder near mine as we bent over a shared screen. Each contact was brief, restrained, but charged with emotion, the slow burn now tangible, a rhythm pulsing between us. There were also moments of quiet humor, of lightness that balanced the intensity. A shared smile when one of us fumbled a phrase, a subtle chuckle when a minor office mishap occurred. Those moments reminded us that connection is as much about ease as it is about tension, that intimacy thrives not only in vulnerability but also in comfort and shared joy. Emotionally, it was exhausting and exhilarating. I felt my own hesitations and insecurities laid bare, admiration for her strength, awe at her poise, and a deep yearning tempered by respect. She, too, was opening herself in ways that defied her usual self-containment, revealing cracks in the armor she rarely showed anyone. And yet, all of this was unspoken, we navigated it through gestures, glances, and subtle touches that spoke louder than words. By the end of this part, the foundation of our bond had shifted. It was no longer just curiosity or attraction, it was understanding, emotional intimacy, and mutual respect intertwined with desire. Vulnerability had broken through the walls of restraint, and for the first time, we both allowed ourselves to feel the depth of what was developing between us. The slow burn was no longer just simmering beneath the surface, it was awakening, ready to grow, yet still tempered by the careful respect that defined our connection. By now, everything between us had shifted. The friction of misunderstanding, the slow unraveling of walls, and the subtle vulnerability we had shared had brought us to a place of quiet understanding. The tension was no longer anxiety or uncertainty, it was awareness. A knowing that each glance, each gesture, each brief touch carried meaning beyond words. It was during a late evening in the office that I first truly felt it. Most of the staff had left, the hum of the air conditioning and the faint ticking of the clock were the only sounds. We were reviewing documents side by side, shoulders nearly touching, the soft glow of the desk lamp illuminating her profile. I became acutely aware of her presence, the gentle curve of her hair brushing her cheek, the way her lips parted slightly as she concentrated, the subtle inhale she drew when she noticed me watching her. Each detail was a silent conversation, a language of longing and caution I was only beginning to understand. We didn't speak much, yet the air was charged. When she reached for a file and our hands brushed, neither of us pulled away. Instead, our fingers lingered for a heartbeat, a silent acknowledgement of connection. There was no need for words, the moment itself carried warmth, reassurance, and an unspoken promise that we understood each other on a level that went beyond professional or societal boundaries. In these quiet interactions, we explored emotional intimacy without crossing into overt romance. A hand resting briefly on hers, a shared smile over a line in a report, a soft laugh that came from mutual amusement rather than propriety, these were the gestures that defined our bond. I began to notice the subtler signs of her affection, too, the way her eyes followed me across the room, the gentle tilt of her head when listening, the almost imperceptible softening of her posture when I was near. These small details were louder than any words could be, and they created a rhythm that only the two of us could follow. The age difference, the social norms, the professional boundaries, all of it was present, but it no longer felt like a barrier. Instead, it added depth, weight, and authenticity to what we were building. I realized that this quiet acceptance, this deliberate patience and awareness, was more intimate than any overt gesture could ever be. It was about acknowledging desire and connection while honoring the space, the timing, and the emotional readiness of both of us. By the end of this part, the slow burn had reached its peak. There was no dramatic confession, no sweeping romantic gesture, just a mutual understanding that we were both aware of what we felt and that we valued it. The tension was not frustration but anticipation, not confusion but clarity. We had reached a point where connection, restraint, and awareness coexisted, creating a bond that was both delicate and profoundly real. And in that quiet, dimly lit office, I felt it, a sense of belonging, a recognition that despite the boundaries, the age difference, and the societal expectations, we had found a space that was ours alone. The slow burn wasn't just simmering anymore, it was steady, alive, and undeniable, preparing us for the moment when choices and emotional courage would define the next step of our story. Everything we had navigated, the walls, the tension, the misunderstandings, the quiet vulnerability, led to this moment. The slow burn that had threaded through weeks of shared glances, brief touches, and unspoken conversations had transformed into something undeniable, clarity. Not in the form of grand gestures or dramatic confessions, but in a quiet, steady realization that the connection between us could no longer be ignored. It happened on a late afternoon, sunlight spilling softly through the tall office windows. We were alone, the office finally emptied, leaving only the hum of the ventilation system and the faint rustle of papers. I noticed her first, the way she sat, shoulders relaxed yet poised, fingers drumming lightly on the table. There was an openness in her posture that had never been there before, a subtle invitation for honesty. I took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of her presence, and suddenly the years of hesitation, restraint, and unspoken tension culminated in a single, weighty awareness. We both felt it. We didn't speak immediately. Instead, we shared a look, long, steady, loaded with the accumulation of everything we hadn't said. Her eyes, bright and expressive, held a mix of curiosity, care, and perhaps relief. My chest tightened, not with anxiety, but with recognition. In that moment, it was no longer about professional boundaries or social perception. It was about two people acknowledging the emotional truth that had grown between them, mutual respect, deep admiration, and an affection that transcended caution. I reached out slowly, and this time, the touch was intentional yet gentle, my hand brushing hers as I handed over a folder, lingering just enough to communicate what words couldn't. She didn't pull away. Instead, she allowed the touch, letting it speak for both of us. A small, soft smile curved her lips, and I felt a warmth that was equal parts relief and anticipation. No dramatic confession was needed, the tenderness of the gesture said everything. We shared a quiet conversation afterward, not rushed, not theatrical. She admitted that she had been wary of crossing boundaries but that she had also felt the same pull, the same unspoken understanding. I shared my own fears, my admiration for her, and the way her presence had reshaped my perception of connection, patience, and emotional depth. Each word was measured, each pause deliberate, each glance heavy with meaning. There was no need to rush, we had already built a foundation that didn't require dramatics. By the end, there was a sense of closure, but also a beginning. We chose together, through our quiet gestures, shared smiles, and lingering hands, to explore what this connection could be. The age difference, the professional context, and the world outside were still present, but they no longer defined the bond between us. Instead, respect, patience, and emotional honesty became the pillars of what we had created. As we left the office that day, side by side, there was no grand proclamation, only a soft, shared acknowledgement, a warmth that lingered between us, and the certainty that the slow burn had reached its full, satisfying flame. What had started as a tension-filled text, a single line declaring autonomy and respect, had grown into a connection both of us had nurtured carefully, slowly, and intentionally. In the quiet, intentional gestures and the weight of shared understanding, we found resolution, not only in our emotions but in ourselves, together yet grounded in reality, ready for whatever came next.